Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Scheck. I'm a member of the board of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. Welcome to you and welcome to the people who are connected and viewing us online. Welcome to the event, which is entitled Applied Environmental Diplomacy Pathways to Sustainability in the Jordan River Basin. This event is in the framework of a series of yearly events that we hold in the memory of the late Noam Siegel, who was a great collaborator and friend of the Institute. And we will kick off with a few words from two people who will speak about Noam, and we will start with his father, Dr. Peretz Siegel. Please.
Honorable scholars from the Arava Institute and the Oxford Martin School. Did you hear my first opening? Okay, so I'll start again. Honorable scholars from the Arava Institute and the Oxford Martin School, Oxford University, practitioners from Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, ladies and gentlemen. We were very touched that you dedicated the event in memory of our beloved son Noam. Especially, we thank you for continuing with his initiative to advance science-led environmental diplomacy. Noam invested so much efforts to establish it, but unfortunately passed just before it launched. Every day I look on Noam's photo beside my bed and think of what he lost. His love to his wife, children and family, and his friendship with colleagues. Furthermore, his loss of meaningful life full with desire to make a better world. In a memorial family album on Noam that his wife Vered edited, there's a recipe for a perfect father that his children wrote towards Father's Day in the year 2018. I'll read some parts of it. 1 cup of coolness, 1 kilo storytelling, half a kilo of trips in nature, 2 kilo ice skating, 3 kilo biking, a daily bottle of orange juice, a bag of board games, 200 gram changing slippers, 500 gram of computer skill, 160 grams preparing sushi, 1 kilo of joking, and infinite grams of love. But they conclude, don't try to prepare, there isn't another father like him. We wish you a delicate recipe for this far-reaching initiative by which Noam's memory will be blessed. Thank you.
The next person to speak a few words about Noam is a former colleague of his who will join us online, Dr. Javier Lazome, who is co-investigator in the Oxford Martin Program on Transboundary Resource Management research program, analyzing the potential for cross-border cooperation on natural resources in the Eastern Nile Basin and the Jordan Valley Basin. I hope Javier is with us, and if you are, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. It's an honor to be with you today, even if it's only virtually. My name is Javier Lezaun. I direct the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at the University of Oxford, which was Noam's academic home at Oxford. I believe his plan to come to our institute originated in a meeting that Noam had with our late colleague, Steve Rayner. I was not at that meeting, but I always thought that Steve and Noam must have hit it off, because Steve was not one to rush to embrace new collaborators. And the fact that he had invited Noam to come to Oxford and join the Institute told me already that Noam was a very special intellectual and colleague. At the Institute, Noam worked on the ideas that will become the Oxford Martin program for transboundary resource management. And there were two things that struck me immediately about Noam's outlook. One, of course, was his deep commitment to sustainable energy futures and to environmental justice. But I was also struck, and I think this is probably what brought him and Steve together. I was struck by Noam's appreciation of the political power of science. And by the political power of science, I do not mean that science should be put at the service of political ideas, but rather than I think he was convinced that science and scientific evidence was a powerful instrument to effect political change, particularly in areas of entrenched political conflict. And that being able to use science for that purpose required a very precise understanding of institutional realities. I was recently rereading what I think is the first document or text that Noam put together, or at least circulated at the Institute in the fall of 2017. It's a document he called a blueprint for Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, in which he presents, and I quote, a vision for sustainable water and energy security based on transboundary cooperation, which recognizes and addresses the political conflict. And the most noticeable element in that document is this emphasis on finding politically viable solutions, solutions that will have traction under very challenging political circumstances, but will also help change those circumstances for the better. So I'm really pleased that Noam's ideas continue to be put into practice by the Araba Institute, by the Oxford Martin program, and by their partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Javier. Thank you. So this year's Noam Siegel event, for this year's event, we are taking advantage of the presence of a very distinguished group of scientists from Oxford who are currently visiting Israel in the framework of this one of the leading projects of the Track 2 Environmental Forum. And they will present some of their work as they have done over the past few days to Israeli officials, to Palestinian officials, and starting tomorrow to Jordanian officials. Through the evening, you will understand the rationale, both of the Track 2 Environmental Forum and of the specific input that this unique partnership with the Oxford Martin School has brought to our projects and vision. The Arava Institute has in its DNA the notion of regional cooperation long before it was such a buzzword as it is today across the region and beyond the region. But as we will hear later in the evening, the Arava Institute is an academic institution and had sort of the confines of its campus. But in the past few years, we have really grown beyond that, and we are very proud of a number of projects on the ground that bring the experience and know-how of the Arava Institute together with Palestinian partners and Jordanian partners to the real people, to the societies living in this area. And with time, we have discovered that we can use environmental challenges as a way to bring together across the borders people who don't usually talk to each other. And on the other hand, we can use diplomatic tools in order to help resolve cross-boundary environmental challenges, and most importantly, those connected to climate change. So we have this long-term vision of developing what I sometimes call a new branch on a very old tree of diplomacy, which would be applied environmental diplomacy, with a big A on the applied, as you will hear during the evening. In order to introduce maybe the beginning of this discussion, we will all watch a short video about the Arava Institute, and then we will continue with our speakers.
Because the environment can't wait for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and the Arava Institute was founded in order to advance cross-border environmental cooperation in the face of political conflicts.
The Arava Institute has research centres, cooperation initiatives and an academic program.
The Arava Institute is unique because it's decided to deal with transboundary environmental issues in our region.
The goal is to take the theory from the classroom about water, about partnerships, about the shared environment, and to apply these theories on the ground to improve people's lives and to build a different narrative.
Here, the role of the Arava Institute is actually to build a consortium of researchers, of regional leaders, to bring them together and to plan the future action that will help us adapt and mitigate climate change in our region.
When we look at the big picture, it's very hard to find a starting point. The Arava Institute provides a starting point where we can actually work together on tangible projects that change the situation of communities and the environment on the ground, and doing that through fostering trust.
The work that the Arava Institute does in climate change adaptation and mitigation actually touches upon the food security, the energy security, the water security issues that are important for our region, and that they are important for the environmental justice of the region that we live in.
Our academic program prepares future leaders, both from Israel, Palestine, Jordan and around the world, to really come together and to work on environmental issues and environmental challenges.
We work also with communities in Palestine, in Jordan, in Gaza, in the Negev.
I think the Arava Institute demonstrates a way where true collaboration can happen.
Before I came here, I had this idea of what the people on the other side may think, what they may speak about, how they interact, and now I know that what I thought was completely different than what I realized today.
I come here, I see something different. I see like the people who is like take caring for us. It's like we're sharing everything together, and now we are living together.
Part of our program is bringing people together, not only to learn, but also to live together. We build the program in order to provide space for getting to know one another, for building trust, for having sometimes difficult conversations, with the purpose of really creating long-lasting friendships and connection.
It just widens your heart, you know? It's like you're just filled with love for the environment and for people and for culture and for language.
The Institute's vision is to take all of this and turn it into a global center for applied environmental diplomacy that uses the environment to build peace in the region so that we can pass off to our children a world which is more sustainable and more peaceful.
We live together in this region, and we have to work together to solve our region's environmental problems. We don't have the luxury to give up.
So the Track 2 Environmental Forum is the brainchild of a few people who a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, got together in order to try and envision where the Arava Institute should be going in the future. One of these people is David Lehrer, the same from the video, who at the time was director of the Arava, executive director of the Arava Institute, position he held for many, many years. So many of the programs of the institute date back to the period where David was in charge there. Dr. David Lehrer left us roughly a year ago, a bit less, to teach at Boston University and to rediscover his home country, the United States. He spent many weeks traveling around the country. And he is freshly off the plane, practically back here for our event. David will immediately take on new responsibilities at the Institute. He will be Director of International Development, and among many other tasks that he will be expected to help with, the Track 2 Environmental Forum will heavily rely on his well-proven skills. So please, David, come and say a few words about the forum.
Okay. Do I use this or this? Does this work? Use this? Yeah, okay. So because we believe that the environment can't wait for peace between Palestinians and Israelis and peoples in the region, and because we believe that by working together on common environmental concerns like climate change, we build a more peaceful relationship with our neighbors, the Arava Institute is dedicated to advancing cross-border environmental cooperation despite the political conflicts. As Dani said, a few years ago, the Arava Institute decided to take what we teach in the classroom and what we study through our research and try it out on the ground to create real proof of concept that cooperation, especially environmental cooperation and natural resource cooperation, can have a positive impact on people in the region. So we live in this kind of feedback loop of natural resources which impact wars and conflict, which impact ecosystems, which then impact the availability of natural resources. And then if you add to that population growth and climate change and an increase in consumption, you get this increasing feedback loop. And these can have institutional impacts around our region, an example of a wastewater facility that overflowed in Gaza. The Track 2 Environmental Forum, as Danny said, was founded about 5 years ago, 2016, to promote environmental agreements between Jordan, Israel, and Palestine to improve lives, protect the environment, and protect and build peaceful relations. It's most important based on trust. That's the key element to cooperation. It's a partnership between Palestinian and Israeli NGO, which is based on trust. We have direct relations with many of the community leaders that we work with. And with them, with the community leaders, we try to analyze what are the problems that they face. We don't come from above and say, this is the solution. We say, what are the problems and how can we help to support that? We came up with a kind of formula that we started with Track 2, but we feel like this has a real lesson to learn about how to apply environmental diplomacy. Instead of looking at these mega projects, top-down infrastructure mega projects, we bring bottom-up solutions. And the reason that these are effective is because, first of all, they're smaller. The initial investment is smaller, making them easier to come in. They're managed by the beneficiaries. They're modular, and they can be scaled up. And they have long-term sustained operation because the beneficiaries are the ones that are running them, not government. On the other hand, government officials are important. National government officials are critical. We can't get equipment into Gaza without that. We can't get people to cross borders without government assistance. We can't get information, data, without government partnerships. And so this Track 2 Environmental Forum is not only engaging local leaders and community leaders, but also reaching top down as well. It's a multinational network, as you see here, people from Oxford University, people from Palestine, people from Jordan, from Israel, and now we're stretching out into countries in the MENA region. And what's critical is that these are proof of concept, but the idea is to develop something that can be scaled up and replicated so that you can actually solve real national and international problems. And as just a few quick examples of some of the stuff we've already done, remember we met in this forum about 2.5 years ago or almost 3 years ago, I guess, at the very start of the pandemic, Erev pandemic, as we say. And at that time, much of what I'm showing you now was really just in the pipeline, or we were thinking about it, or we were testing it. But today, we've already managed to get a number of atmospheric water generators into Gaza with the cooperation of government leaders and local community leaders providing clean water, drinking water that is produced from the atmosphere, produced from the humidity in the atmosphere. And this is with the partnership with a for-profit company with WaterGen. It has even managed to provide water to Palestinians in Gaza a year ago during the May conflict when water supplies were cut. And in certain regions, our WaterGen was the only source of clean drinking water. Another problem that many face in the region is wastewater treatment and a lack of wastewater treatment. And so in the past year, we've managed to introduce a modular wastewater treatment system into Abasan al-Kabira, a small community in Gaza where a neighborhood is being serviced by this. Excuse me. And here you can see that this system was being put into place exactly during the war. And even though work on the system stopped in May during the war, as soon as the war was over, everybody went back to work, and the system is now operational. Another problem that is faced in Gaza that we are working on now is the fact that solar energy has become one of the main sources of electricity for a lot of people in those communities where the electricity from the grid is no longer reliable. And therefore, people are putting, it's probably one of the fastest growing communities in the world where solar energy is being adopted, rooftop solar. But that comes with batteries. Batteries, because people want electricity at night, those batteries are often very cheap acid-based batteries, which end up having to be disposed of, and there is no toxic waste site. There's no hazardous waste site in Gaza, so those batteries get thrown into the garbage dumps, into the Mediterranean Sea, and poisoning the aquifers. And so we're working on solutions, again, to get those batteries out and to bring them to Israel's hazardous waste site. And this would be a great example of environmental cooperation, cross-border environmental cooperation. Another project that we're very proud of is a large treated wastewater pipeline that for many, many years, for I think about 15 years, had been agreed upon by both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli civil administration in principle, but in practice was not moving forward because they couldn't agree on the route we entered into that discussion with the Palestinian Water Authority and the civil administration and said, we want to help. So the Israeli army officer who was in charge said, okay, great, come with me. Took us on a tour of the West Bank, showed us where this wastewater treatment pipeline would be able to be built, bringing treated water from the Ramallah area down to the Jericho area where it would be used by farmers. At the end of that tour, he handed us this map and said, here's 4 routes that we approve of, the Israeli civil administration. Take them to the Palestinian Water Authority because we're not talking to them. We took it to the Palestinian Water Authority. We said, here's 4 routes. We want you to recommend which route you approve of. They took it, they did a report, came back to us and said, okay, here's our report, take our name off it, put your name on it, give it to the Israelis because we're not talking to them. We brought it back to the Israeli officer, he looked at it, he opened up and said, oh great, this is the route 1 one of the routes that we'd approved of. We said, okay, now we can have a meeting. The Israeli officer says, now we can meet with the Palestinians. He invited the Palestinian Water Authority to come a week later. They walked into the room. They said, they saw the report on the table. The head of the delegation who had written the report saw the report on the delegation. He picked it up, he looked at it, and he says, oh, we can live with this. And that's how we managed to get, I don't know what's going on here. That's how we managed to get that project moving forward. And so those are just a few examples of some of the ideas that we've tried to bring to the table and on the ground, because we believe that what we do, what we study, what we teach is important, but if it can't be actualized, if it can't be applied, then what does it mean? And we hope that by doing this, we're able to create a model, one, for relationship building, to be able to prove that yes, we can work together, and 2, in order to improve lives, and 3, in order to present options for wider solutions for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. As MC, I have the privilege not just to talk about subject matter, but to deal with the really important stuff. So I've been instructed to tell you that if you have parked your car here outside and you have not gone through our registration, you may live to regret it. So please, if you have a car here and you need a parking ticket stamped or whatever, please, on your way out, stop at the registration desk. As I said at the very beginning, this event is taking place in many ways in honor of this prestigious group of Oxford scholars who are visiting us and who have done amazing work throughout this week and no doubt will continue. And in the next large portion of our event, we will dive a little bit into the work that they have been doing. But in order to introduce the, how should I call it, the Oxford Martin School program in general, and this specific one, I will ask my friend Dr. Richard Kaplan, who is co-investigator on the Oxford Martin program on transboundary resource management, and who is a professor of international law, which means that the stuff he talks about I can actually understand. So he will come and introduce the program, and then we will hear some more specific findings from the other colleagues of his. There you go, Richard. Thank you.
Danny, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back among friends in the region. And I'll just say, personally, it was, for me, a great pleasure to know Noam Siegel very briefly, very sadly, because it was so brief. But I want to just start with a reflection on Noam because Noam had an ambition to harness scientific knowledge for the purpose of meeting some of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. And the Oxford Martin program on transboundary transboundary resource management has been conceived with the same ambition in mind, funded by the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. The program aims to promote practical cross-border cooperation on natural resources in the Nile River Basin and the Jordan River Basin. And for purposes of our meeting this evening, I'm going to be focusing, and we're going to be focusing on the work that we're doing in the lower Jordan River Basin. Well, here we are. David alluded already to the environmental stresses in the region, of which there are many. These are, of course, only too familiar to you, including, of course, climate change, increased demand for water and energy, pollution of various kinds. David has just talked about groundwater pollution, air pollution as well, contamination of the soil, population growth, growing pressures as a consequence of the growing populations, including refugees, of course, many of them fleeing some of the most violent conflicts that the region has known for some time, as well as the increased carbon emissions throughout the region. And these are shared, many of them shared in common challenges. They're not unique to one country, one territory, but they are common across the region. And associated with them are various national and regional risks. The degraded environment and increased demands on resources leading to health and disease risks within and between the countries. We saw this very evidently, of course, through the COVID pandemic, which did not in any way respect borders, political borders. The inhibition, stifling of economic development opportunities as a consequence of poor and declining water and energy resources, the increased risk of both social and political tensions, posing sometimes very real, anticipated real existential threats in the region that have the prospect of spilling over, and for that reason, risking political and sociability on a wider regional basis. And so we ask ourselves, how can these challenges best be met? How can they best be managed? And with a focus specifically on growing pressure on energy, on scarce water supplies, and increasing demand for sustainable sources of energy, we set out effectively to test two propositions, which are here on the screen. One, that cross-border cooperation on resource management can yield greater environmental and economic benefits than national siloed approaches will. But at the same time, we recognize that national measures can be taken, and examples of that would be wastewater treatment or the reduction of water leakage, that can also increase resilience throughout the region. So we have an approach which you're going to see in the presentations that follow, that consist of several different elements. And I should start by saying that one, I think, distinctive characteristic feature of this program is that it's interdisciplinary, bringing together environmental scientists, engineers, political scientists, diplomats, industry experts, community leaders. I think that this is very unusual for the kind of work that is being done in this area. We also employ a unique modeling and approach, and in a few moments I'm going to introduce our colleague, Professor Jim Hall, who will tell you about the modeling that we've been doing to generate scenarios for how resources and infrastructure can be managed effectively in transboundary regions. We also consult with local stakeholders and local experts. Again, this goes back to the point that David made. It is not Oxford helicoptering in to tell people in the region how things can be managed differently. We consult very, very closely for various reasons: to analyze, to gather and analyze data, to develop proposals for new infrastructural and institutional arrangements, both small and large, to manage transboundary environmental pressures. And in the same spirit, we work with former senior officials nationally and internationally. One of them is Danny Sheck, in fact, to help us understand both the obstacles and the opportunities for making progress in this very important area of cooperative resource management. And we're trying to encourage new ways of thinking in particular about security in the region that takes account of the existential threat that environmental stresses pose. So transcending the traditional conceptions of security that have characterized thinking for so long in this region. Finally, just to say a little bit about what we've identified as ways forward. One is to, in line with what I've just been saying, help to construct, help to promote new ways of thinking, new narratives of environment, of national security that, as I said, take into consideration the environmental dimension. Also to promote joint discussion with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan on respective future energy and water plans. And we've been very successful in doing that in this trip, meeting with officials across the region. Also promoting joint local renewable energy and water projects. David has referred to some of these on a small scale, but we're also thinking large scale about projects, for instance, solar fields in Jordan on a much larger scale that could contribute to a mitigation of the pressures of the challenges that we're facing in the region. Joint research and development, and also taking advantage of the rapprochement between Israel and Gulf states to promote possible investment and regional cooperation. I have to say that everything that we've been able to do in the region, we've only been able to do with the support of the Arva Institute's Environmental Studies Track 2 Forum, which has opened the door. They have tremendous experience and links. We are building on the experience that they have and really developing our work, I would say, in the same spirit of fostering trust among parties, recognizing that we can only really build a future together to address these problems in conditions of trust. And I just want to conclude with an excerpt from a study that our own Deborah Sandler, Mike Herzog, and Raith Al-Amari published with the Israel National Security Studies Institute. And I'll just read, I think, a section from this, which I think speaks very clearly to the compelling reason for the program that we're presenting to you this evening. Without intervention, the alarming threats of rising temperatures, mismanagement of dwindling natural resources, and interdependent water, energy, and food resources can lead to insecurities and health pandemics along with surges of refugees, civil unrest, and an increased risk of internal or external war. And I don't think that this is an exaggeration. This is the future I fear that we face in the absence of effective intervention. So I now want to turn the podium over remotely. Unfortunately, Professor Jim Hall is not able to be with us in person. But just to introduce Jim, who is the principal investigator of the Oxford team, he's the professor of climate and environmental risks in the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. And he's going to talk with us about the modeling that is being done in support of the work of this program.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, for that introduction. And I'd like to begin, as others have done before me, in recognizing Noam Siegel and the contribution that he made to initiating this Oxford Martin School program on transboundary resource management. Noam was quite unique in his perspective and his capacity to bring together different disciplinary approaches, which is reflected in the design of this program, which combines quantification and modeling to give a sense of proportion of the natural resource problems that are faced in the region, with understanding of the politics, the diplomacy, the international relations, and thirdly, learning from action on the ground from the Track 2 program, which we've heard about, which helps to overcome practical barriers and make first steps towards collaborative action. And I see those things as being the three pillars of this Oxford Martin School program. In a moment, I'll hand over to my two colleagues, Michael Gilmont and Aman Majid, who are going to talk about the analysis and modeling work that they've been doing in water and energy, respectively, working closely with our partners in the region. But I'll just say a few introductory words to kind of set the scene for what that modeling is about and why it's important. As I say, it is just one of the three pillars of this program, but it's an important pillar because it gives a sense of proportion. It provides a context for the Track 2 activities in terms of understanding the scale of the challenges that we face at the moment and the ways in which those challenges might evolve going into the future. We're using the tools of quantified systems analysis, of modeling. For people who are not versed in these techniques, they can possibly seem remote, possibly even alienating. But what, as you will see from Michael and Aman, is that we're quantifying the sources of water and energy, quantifying the ways in which those resources are being used, both at the present and in future scenarios. These are models that work on different timescales. The energy model, because of the time of day variation in the use of energy and the supply of renewable energy from solar panels and the wind, varies from hour to hour. This has to be an hourly model, whereas the variation in water is over longer time scales, and we can work on an annual time scale with the water systems analysis. But in both cases, we're using these models to have dialogue with partners in the region, to develop shared understanding and shared scenarios for the future. In water, as you'll hear from Michael, and I certainly don't want to steal the thunder from either of my colleagues, but to set the scene at least, we've already seen the situation of a degraded aquatic environment, flows in the Jordan River, a tenth of what they were naturally, the Dead Sea lowering its elevation, untreated wastewater being discharged both onto land, onto wadis, and into the sea, groundwater levels going down, and groundwater aquifers becoming polluted, both with waste and with saltwater intrusion. Meanwhile, the broad parameters of water in the region are understood. Israel is approaching a surplus of water supply capacity compared to the water that's used because of innovation in desalination and wastewater reuse, and accompanying policy and regulatory reforms accompanying that. Jordan also, with a combination of a growing amount of treated wastewater in their plans, the plan for the Aqaba desalination plant, and agreements for increased transfer from Israel to Jordan, potentially can cope with some of the increasing demand for water that it faces in the future. It's in Palestine that we see the Palestinians facing inadequate water resources and unaffordable resources. The scenarios we've looked at, which Michael will present, look at ways in which those gaps can be filled, and some steps can be taken to restoring the aquatic environment. But looking at that regionally and building in opportunities for cooperation open up a wider solution space. It's in energy that the world is changing most rapidly, however. We see dramatically reducing costs of renewables, ambitious renewable energy targets across the region, including discussion of a commitment to net zero within Israel. And that together is proving to be a game changer. Israel is no longer just looking at gas for energy self-sufficiency. Jordan has a way of overcoming its historic issue of the cost of fossil fuel imports. The Palestinians have the opportunity of affordable and resilient energy systems, and entering into power purchase agreements with both of their neighbors, which means that they potentially are rather more resilient. Of course, we know the barriers as well. They're political. They're to do with the practicalities of permits on the ground. There are also issues of grid capacity, of whether grids can absorb all of this renewable energy. But these are problems which, via Track 2 and the experience on the ground, there are potential cooperative solutions. And in our presenting this work in the region last week, I just came back from Israel on Friday. We presented the simulation model that you'll see in a moment from Amman, and it was met with a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement, both by the energy minister in the Palestinian Authority and within the energy ministry in Israel. They want to get their hands on this model, kick the tires, validate it in their own minds, as I'm sure the Jordanians will when the work is presented to them this week. And we are very enthusiastic about building capacity via training. We're thinking of a joint workshop which would have technical delegates from all three jurisdictions, training in systems modeling, and analysis of energy futures, which would also gradually build up the capacity of delegates to use this modeling system, and challenging the participants in the workshop to develop future pathways, as well as exploring the barriers and thinking through how a joint technical working group might be configured in the future. And we hope that by the end of that workshop, the delegates themselves will be able to present what they've learned and some potential pathways and into the future. That all is tentative plans for now, and forgive me for perhaps running ahead a little bit in terms of what our next steps might be. But before I hand over to our modelers, I wanted to give some sense that we're thinking about the next steps for this program in partnership with the Arava and Track 2 and other partners in the region. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleagues to go into a little more depth in the modeling results.
Thank you very much, Jim. So we'd like to hear from three of our experts. But I'd just like to take a moment to say that we in the Track 2 Environmental Forum and in general, the people active around the Arava Institute and Damour and all these organizations, we sort of live in a kind of cloud where everything works well, but occasionally we are reminded of realities on the ground. So I'd like to take a moment just to welcome our Palestinian partners from Damour, who were held up by an uncooperative Israeli checkpoint. But they're here now, so I'd like to welcome them. Ashraf Ajrami, who is co-chair of Track 2, Tahani Abudaka, our friend who's in charge of so many wonderful projects in Gaza, and Dr. Shadad Atili, who will join us on a panel a little bit later. So we will start with the first presentation on energy. To introduce this, we will welcome Dr. Aman Majid, who is a research associate at the Oxford Martin School's program on transboundary resource management, focusing on the Jordan Basin. And on this project he's leading the model development to map sustainable development pathways of the energy and water sectors in Israel. He will do the presentation on energy. He was supposed to be joined by an Israeli colleague, Nurit Gal, but we lost her to the latest version of COVID-19, so he will do it on his own. Please.
Thanks very much. Firstly, I just want to start off by saying that, unfortunately, I only had the very briefest interaction with Noam. A couple of years ago, when I was a PhD student in my first year, I reached out to Noam because of his expertise and asked for 30 minutes of his time for help with my PhD. He gave me about 3 hours, so we talked about lots of ideas, and eventually the ideas we talked about ended up being the first chapter of my thesis. Jim remarked about the fact that Noam had a remarkable ability to bring things together, and on this occasion he brought together the disaster that was my PhD thesis. So my name is Aman Majid. I've been leading some of the energy analysis on this project. So essentially we're looking at the potential for regional cooperation in the energy system. So first, a bit of background. So as we know, everywhere we need to be reducing CO2 emissions. That's the big challenge to tackle climate change. And because the power sector is one of the largest emitter of CO2 emissions, that's one of the big things that we need to target. The graphic on the left here is showing you CO2 emissions in Israel, Jordan, and Palestine towards the bottom end. This is on a log scale. So what we see is that they're not emitting quite as much as the big emitters like China, the US, and the UK, but they still need to reduce their CO2 emissions. And that's reflected by their NDC targets, essentially their targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see on the top right there, in 2030, Israel wants to decarbonize by about 27%. Jordan has a slightly higher target of 31%. Palestine has these targets for 2040. There's two targets there. One is dependent on them having their own state, which is 26.6%, and the business as usual scenario is 17.5. Now, decarbonization goes hand in hand with increasing renewable energy. So this bottom right table here is showing you the renewable energy targets in the region. So today we see Israel has about 8.5% of renewables in its system. That needs to jump up to about 30% by 2030. So there's a big gap there. Jordan is around 20%, and it has this very ambitious target to increase to about 50% renewables by 2030. And Palestine is around 5%, which needs to increase by 20% by 2030. And the way that's going to happen is these big fossil fuel plants like coal and gas, they're going to be decommissioned, and gradually renewables will increase. There's a big question around speed and scale. So are those targets enough, or do you need to do more? And most of the recent evidence from organizations such as the IPCC, the IEA, show that we need to go much faster and quicker. Sorry, much faster and at a greater scale. So this graphic on the right, which I actually can't see, but it shows where Israel and Jordan are at the moment. We don't have data for Palestine, so we couldn't plot it. And by 2030, we need to be down to around 50 to 125 grams of CO2 for every bit of energy that we produce. And essentially, we need to go really quickly here and reaching net zero by 2050, essentially producing zero carbon from energy systems. So now I'll give you a little bit of insight into the energy landscape in the region. So this graphic here shows firstly the power system in the region, where we can see that there's basically no connectivity between Jordan and Israel. There's some connectivity between Jordan and the West Bank, and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, etc. are connected in this pan-Arab grid. So essentially Israel acts as a virtual energy island. The per capita consumption in electricity, we see significant disparities. Basically, Israel has more electricity per capita than their neighbors. And then the graphic on the right highlights that point and also shows that the Palestinian territories, Gaza and West Bank, are really reliant on imports for their energy needs. Yet there's big potential for solar and wind in the region. So Jordan particularly is one of the best places in the world for solar energy and has some pretty significant wind potential as well. And each region faces some issues. So in Israel, they're really struggling to increase their renewable capacity. Land permits for renewables are hard to get. And there's better potential in their neighbors. And in Jordan, essentially there's some grid stability issues, and not all renewable energy can be used. You need to match supply of renewables with demand, and it's a bit harder to do that in Jordan. And in Palestine, power supplies are still unreliable, particularly in Gaza, and they want to increase their energy self-sufficiency. They're mostly reliant on imports at the moment, and they want to change that. So that brings me on to our project. What we want to do is map energy systems to 2030, considering three things: those decarbonization goals that I showed before, renewable goals, again, that I showed before, and different levels of regional cooperation. How do we do that? So we set up a model which takes some inputs. So we try and map growth projections of population and energy demands into the future, along with some technical stuff that you don't really need to worry about. And then we have some scenarios. So there's varying levels of cooperation between the regions. I'll get onto that in the next slide. Self-sufficiency targets in Palestine, as well as those emissions targets and renewables targets. That then feeds into the model. What it does first is plans capacity. So it builds stuff. It builds some gas and solar and wind and things like this. And then it simulates the performance of the energy system with whatever you've built and the sort of configuration of the network. And what we get out of it is some capacity estimates, costs, technology mixes, the expected emissions, and so on. Unfortunately, I couldn't do a live demo for you. I'm sure you would have been really, really excited to see that. But so these are some snapshots of the models that we've developed and the data platforms. So the one on the left actually is the water one. And then on the right, we've got the power system data portal. And if you're really, really interested, you can go look at the code online. It's all open source. I really encourage it. So here are the scenarios that we're looking at. So essentially on these axes, we've got on the Y, increasing decarbonization ambition. So, and on the X, we've got increasing cooperation. So one scenario is no cooperation, that's denoted by NCO, meaning every region acts like an energy island. Israel does its own thing, West Bank does its own thing, Jordan does its own thing. Then there's a business as usual, so we just go as we currently are, the status quo, and see what happens. And there's a full cooperation scenario denoted by that COO, and that's the acronym that you need to be looking out for in the following slides. All scenarios consider future demands, renewables targets, and also Palestinian self-sufficiency, which is targeted at 30% by 2030. So here are some preliminary results. Firstly, what we see is that cooperation is a lot cheaper. So it costs about $18.3 billion, which just sounds like quite a bit. And that's reducing costs by about 9.4% relative to the status quo scenario. So that's a fairly substantial reduction. And what we see also is that investment in Jordan increases by about 2.4 times. And the reason for that is because, okay, so this graphic is showing you the build-outs of various technologies. Essentially, the thing you need to know is that most of the solar is built in Jordan in a fully cooperative scenario. They've got a higher potential, and most of the renewable energy is then exported to Jordan's neighbors. And overall, you see a lot less build-out of renewable energy. So that decreases by about 24%. So you just need less solar panels to meet those targets to 2030. Accordingly, you need to increase solar capacity in Jordan quite a bit more under a cooperative scenario. As I said before, there's increased investment there. Now, meeting renewables targets and increasing renewables isn't quite as simple as just building out loads of solar and wind. You also need to balance the grid a lot more because renewables are variable. And what we also observe is that in a cooperative system, you can do that a lot better. So you get about 20% more utilization of renewables. So every unit of renewable energy you produce, you can use more of that in a cooperative system. This trade-off curve shows the effect of Palestine's self-sufficiency targets, its effect on the total installed capacity in Israel on the left and Palestine on the right. And essentially on the x-axis here, you increase self-sufficiency all the way up to 100%. And what we see is that if Palestine was to go fully self-sufficient, you would need about 8% less capacity in Israel. But that does come at a significant cost for Palestine. So you need about 12 times the capacity that they have today to get them to 100% self-sufficiency. This is probably the most interesting slide for me in this whole thing. So this is looking at essentially hitting net zero by 2050, that issue around speed and scale that I was talking about before. So on the x-axis here, we're gradually increasing renewables in the system, meaning we're decarbonizing accordingly. And what we see here is that under a cooperative system, you have to spend about 22% less to hit net zero. That is a really, really significant cost at the scale that we're talking about. So about $47 billion worth of savings there. But what's interesting is that around 80%, so the orange bars are non-cooperative and the green bars are the cooperative scenarios. So around 80% renewables, you have really, really big benefits there. But when you increase up to like 90 to 95% renewables, like really, really, really pushing your decarbonization targets, then the benefits diminish there. And that's primarily because of that load balancing issue that I was talking about before. So some conclusions, what have we learned? So firstly, cooperative energy planning and management has significant benefits, reduces costs by about 28%, improves renewable energy uptake, and reduces curtailment. Pursuit of self-sufficiency is really challenging, primarily because it's really hard to utilize those renewables, and it costs twice as much compared to the, actually it's not quite that much, that's an error, but anyway, it costs quite a lot more. And it's got very large costs, particularly for Palestine. And in terms of scale and ambition, cooperating could help us reach net zero much more efficiently. And I think that's it for me. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Aman. That was really impressive to see this work and the results coming out of all that work. So we will move on to a presentation on within the same project, but on water management. Water has always been on the agenda of every discussion about the future of the Middle East. I remember many years where the conventional wisdom was that the next war in the Middle East would be about water. To which the late Shimon Peres always used to say, yes, but it can also be the first topic of cooperation between the regions. Why simply the reason for war? And this is roughly the idea behind our project. So to present the water findings, I will invite two people actually who will present each part of the findings. First, Dr. Suleiman Khalash, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at the University of Oxford. And in his civilian life, he's also director of the Jordanian consulting firm iGreens, which focuses on energy, water, and environment. Suleiman, please. Actually, before you come, I will also introduce the next speaker, so I don't have to interrupt. No, you can come on. You can stand by me, Suleiman. I don't bite. I promise. The next speaker on the topic will be Dr. Michael Gilmont, who is the program manager for the Oxford Martin program on transboundary resource management, and also a research fellow. And his research applies interdisciplinary political, economic, and hydrological approaches to analyzing trends in water resource development, use, and reform, with particular focus on the MENA region. Admit that I read this as if I understood what I was reading.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Does this go a little? Good evening. So I'm Suleiman Halassa, and I'm proud to be in the same group that Noam was, which is the alumni of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. I studied there almost 15 years ago, very long time ago, let's say that. I just want to also to start with mentioning how our last week went and what's going on this week. So we started by having meetings with different governmental agencies in both Israel and Palestine. So we met with both the energy ministries in the Israeli Ministry of Energy, and also we met the Palestinian Minister of Energy, the water authorities, both in the Israeli water authority and the Palestinian water authority. And thanks to, I think Leah is also here. Thank you very much, Leah, for hosting us, and Adel. We also met the negotiations team at in the Palestinian Authority, and we heard from them their vision about what's going on, what's their role, and how they perceive and they see the work that we are doing. We got very interesting feedback from all of them. Like, for me, it's the first time that I see Israelis and Palestinians agreeing on something, which is the outcome or the suggestions that we have in this project, which is very, very interesting for at least for me at personal level. We visited the startup nations as well, and Sigalit is here. Thank you for coming. Very interesting work there, and I think there is a great potential for involving the private sector in the work that we are doing. We need the private sector and the entrepreneurs in a way to come up with the creative ideas of how the output or the outcomes of this work can be implemented. Today we met with the President's Forum for Climate Change. We met with the Jordanian ambassador in the state of Israel. In the rest of this week, we are going to Jordan. We'll meet with also similar the water and energy sectors and different think tanks over there that actually hopefully will make also new connections between the different players in the region. So I would like also to emphasize a major finding that we saw here is like among the three different jurisdictions, it's very, very interesting to see that actually each one of them was mainly focusing on their own resources in the national planning. So if we talk about water and energy, they looked, and as Aman already showed, that Israel as an energy island shows that very well. Like they don't see any potential in working regionally without talking about looking into what is the what's happening next door, how the neighbors are planning also their national strategies. And what we are proposing is maybe by looking regionally and trying to understand what's happening at the regional level, we can come up with more sustainable and efficient solutions for that. So talking about this, if we move to the water, which I think all of us agree that, how to start the presentation here? Yes. So I think all of us agree that we have very limited water resources in the Middle East, which is resulting or making the situation of supplying water very stressful, taking into consideration the population growth, the willingness for every party to increase their per capita water share, and the climate change effect on the water resources, which emphasizes the need of being more creative and create more water, thinking out of the box and create more water resources to achieve or to address that deficit. What we are proposing is a regional approach to solve the water issues, mainly by looking into water sharing, political or policy changes, and also using the technology for water resources. Saying that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Michael Gelmont to go deeper in the model and the analysis that he's been working on for the last few years. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Suleiman. Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. I had the privilege of supporting NOAM in the drafting of the Oxford Martin program, and it has really been an honor and a privilege to have been kind of managing the team at the coalface under the academic leadership of Richard, Jim, and Javier over the last 3 years, as we have turned or tried to turn some of NOAM's vision for this work into reality. So Suleiman, you've mentioned a bit about the sort of the background of water. If we can have the slide back on, please. So what have we been trying to achieve? What is the added value of the research that we're doing on water? Water is very well studied in this region, but there are still gaps, and we think gaps that are very much worth exploring. So the first cut of our analysis has really been trying to achieve an in-depth analysis of national scale data from Palestine, West Bank and Gaza, Jordan and Israel, and delivering what we hope is and will be a nearly consistent data set with, importantly, similar accounting and definition of resources, both at the national scale and as we drill down at the subnational scale as well. So we can start to spatially map what water is used and going where. We're doing this by working with in-country stakeholders, working with those professionals who have who've kindly agreed to come along with us to identify, pull out, refine the data and the accounting. We are then using this data to try to produce regional scenarios for the future of water management. And importantly, linking in with track 2 is using the analysis of data, presentation of scenarios, development of scenarios as a convening space for bringing professionals together, professionals who, for political reasons, otherwise wouldn't necessarily talk to each other, but who can come together over data in a personal capacity to try and iron out some of the uncertainties and gaps in knowledge. Next slide, please. I should press the button, shouldn't I? There we go. It's easier just to request. So our assessment of water use, which I'm going to present in a minute, which Jim has already alluded to, as this first cut uses official government national sources. And we've tried as much as possible to minimize the transformation of that data, so it should really still look familiar to those who are working with it day in, day out. And we've used it to try and assemble this regional picture of both historic over the past decade or so and future to 2030 and hopefully to beyond water supply. Included in this is then the impact of growth in per capita consumption in West Bank and Gaza and in Jordan, and how, as well as with population growth, this really compounds future demands for resources. And what this work shows is that based on current plans through to 2030, there is a deficit in what is planned to be supplied in terms of available resources versus anticipated demand. I should say that these numbers will change. There are new plans being worked on, especially in Ramallah and in Amman at the moment, and we will hopefully over the next few months be updating this according to these new numbers. So what does this analysis show? So firstly, for Israel, as already been alluded to, I should say these slides were produced last week, and in light of our conversations over the past 7 or so days, there will be changes to the numbers, if not hopefully the overall message. We see in Israel a relatively steady allocation for domestic consumption, driven just by population growth. We see a steady, slightly growing amount of agricultural water, mainly growing through treated wastewater. And we see that while there's a growth in demand, the potential for growth in supply is a lot greater to 2030. We expect that excess supply to come down as we understand the numbers a little more. Corollary is it could very well go up in light of the Green-Blue deal between Jordan, UAE and Israel. So the final version of these numbers, while not necessarily with different assumptions, might very well actually have similar numbers. So Israel, potentially there's a surplus of 300 million cubes per year. Take that with a large pinch of salt. But that's one picture. For Jordan, by contrast, we see a rough balance as of 2019 and recent years. But by 2030, a gap between anticipated demand and available supply by about 116 million cubic meters. Again, that number is probably going to be revised down with new water sharing with Israel and with increased desal capacity at Aqaba. But this is the current state of the analysis based on official reports. For Palestine, we see a much more stark picture, one from balance, albeit undersupply at a very low level of per capita use, currently 49 meters cubed per capita per year. Growing 2030 due both to population growth and to increase in per capita supply to 71 cubic meters per year, and also an increase in agricultural supply for irrigation based on growing population, growing desire for food security, and growing utilization of irrigable land. So what that has the effect in doing is potentially seeing a deficit of 431 million cubes per year. So that's the gap between, the gap between planned demand and planned supply. So if we now look at all three graphs, sorry for the slight overlap, I think this is probably the first time we're actually seeing comparable numbers, albeit with a pinch of salt, on the same scale, actually a different scale, sorry, the scales are not adjusted, but the planned numbers for the future of the region laid out next to each other in quite a dramatic fashion. So what does this allow us to start doing? Well, it allows us to start playing around with numbers at the regional scale. If we potentially take into account some kind of Israeli surplus, we can reduce the regional deficit. And we can then start to play around with new options for supply. So that can include treated wastewater, starting to move towards the levels of recovery that Israel is achieving in terms of the amount of domestic water sent back into the agricultural sector at a lower energy intensity than desalination. We see new options for desalination combined with recycling, actually producing a significant amount of addition to the overall water economy. We see the potential to revisit agricultural water growth targets in line with agricultural water productivity and general gains in the region. We see potential for improving leakage in new areas of supply. And we see the potential, we will hopefully be mapping out potential for regional water sharing, geographical transfers, especially with new desalination capacity. So here is one possible scenario of a deficit across the region of 246 million cubes. That could be achieved with recycling alone at 50% recovery in Palestine and in Jordan. Alternatively, 30% recycling with a reduction in agricultural water use. Still growth, but a reduction in the ultimate target. I mentioned that this deficit wasn't the full story. If we consider environmental sustainability of use, so eliminating over-abstraction of groundwater, redressing the undrinkable groundwater in Gaza, redressing the over-abstraction of groundwater, of renewable groundwater in Jordan, we actually see the regional deficit not at 240 something, but at 544. What are the options then to redress that much larger gap? And again, we have two possible initial scenarios. These are very much just illustrative. They are to be refined in conjunction with our partners. But yeah, so we've got either an option of enhanced wastewater and desal, or agricultural growth reduction, enhanced wastewater and desal. So what we're arguing is that a regional approach really offers a larger solution space for addressing deficit and dealing with impacts of climate change and building resilience within the water system as a whole. We hope, or we believe, that additional desal capacity and expertise can offer stability and resilience to both the environment and to the water supply system. Treated wastewater growth, or I think as it's being increasingly called in the West Bank and Gaza, agricultural water, can offer development of new capacity with much less energy, about a third of the energy of seawater desalination. So if we're talking about water energy nexus, there are potential huge gains here. However, as David referred to with Albireo, the development of these resources requires regional cooperation. In fact, in the issue of infrastructure crossing Area C, very close regional cooperation. I'm being asked to finish up. So the next steps, we clearly need to refine our numbers and our scenarios through consultation with our stakeholders. We've started that process. We would like to co-develop further scenarios with our regional stakeholders. We're then engaging closely with track 2 to identify how these big picture numbers can actually be converted to action on the ground. So crudely, could you meet the Palestinian wastewater need by building 30 Albireo trunk lines? You probably wouldn't want to do that, but what are the scalable options that could be proposed around that? And the final element of our future steps is what Jim referred to in terms of training and capacity building in region, but also creating a forum for regional knowledge sharing across both future resource plans, resource gaps, infrastructure, and policy solutions. And our conversations over the last few days in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah have really identified, I think, a strong need for this, and have identified some very illuminating assumptions or cross purposes in terms of assumptions across decision makers that I think there is tremendous opportunity to clarify. Again, importantly, that sort of engagement will occur at the professional rather than political level, and will be based on developing understanding rather than assumptions. This is all obviously also subject to funding. I think that wraps me up. It does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suleiman and Michael. The final portion of our program will be a conversation that I will manage with 4 of our friends here, who I will ask to join me on stage. Deborah Sandler, Tariq Abu Hamad, Shadad Atili, and Gil Murciano. No, I'm here. Okay, so this will be a conversation about the regional dimension of our work and the importance of the regional dimension. We gave it the title of Threats and Opportunities in the Region in the realm of environment. Knowing our friends, I think there will be more talk about opportunities than threats, but we will see how this goes. We don't have very much time, so I will warn the panelists that if you have something important to say to answer my question, say it at the beginning, because you may not get to the end. So I'd like to start with Dr. Tariq Abu Hamad, who is the Executive Director of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. Tariq is a long-time collaborator at the Institute. He was a teacher, he was the academic director, and for the past year, he has been the executive director and is, as such, of course, heavily involved also in the track 2 part of our work. So, Tariq, the Arava Institute obviously is no stranger to the concept of regional cooperation and in general and in particular on environmental issues. But track 2 has in a way broken you out of the bubble of Kibbutz K'tura and the campus into the big wide world. So my question to you is, how is life in the real world?
Okay.
It is.
So, you know, the real world works, it's very dynamic all the time. You mentioned that we are a bubble in the Arava, but this bubble been encouraging regional cooperation since its establishment. And we are very glad to see that many organizations in the region, especially in Israel now, having the regional cooperation on their agenda. We joined the COP26 in Glasgow, and one of the nice conclusions that came out of Glasgow that international cooperation on climate is a must, and regional cooperation is a must. And we've been doing this for the last 25 years. And our next steps is to go beyond this region, to internationalize the work that we do. That's why we apply to the United Nations Environmental Program, and I'm very honored to tell you that we are accredited member now of the UN Environment Assembly of the UNEP. We're also in the process of getting the membership of the UNFCCC in the United Nations. And we want to take this work one step further to do regional cooperation, which is based on science evidence. That's why we work with Oxford University. Projects and ideas for regional cooperation, there are plenty of them, but only few of them are really based on scientific values and data. And currently we are planting the seeds for another project also with Harvard University on environmental, international environmental cooperation.
So yeah, but maybe a little bit more specifically, how does the fact that you are now not just dealing with students and with research impact the work of the institute in the involvement in real life projects?
Look, the work of the Arava Institute is based on building trust between the partners or the stakeholders that deal with environmental issues. And as David said at the beginning, taking this one step further and do impact on the ground goes beyond the academic program that we run. We used to build the trust between the students at the Arava Institute, and we want to build the trust with the partners on the region. We have plenty of peace treaties. We have plenty of natural resources and technologies, and we know how to produce water and renewable energies. And what we lack in this region is not the peace treaties or the natural resources. It's the trust. In the past, we used to chase our partners in the region to do cooperation, and now they come to us with the challenges that they face, and they ask for cooperation to design a solution for the challenges that they face. So we're taking this one step further, and as I said, we want to go beyond that and internationalize the work that we do in the region.
Thank you. Deborah Sandler, a long-time teacher at Oxford, but also a veteran of research and actual work on environmental issues in this region, and currently, luckily for us, co-chair of Track 2. Thank you very much for your involvement in our work. So for many years you've been working on, you've been dealing with various regional aspects of environmental challenges, but as chair of Track 2, you too entered into the realm of real life on the ground projects together with quite an important layer of diplomacy that needs to accompany it. And maybe most importantly for this evening, you were a crucial link to the Oxford Martin School, which made it actually possible, made this partnership possible. I'd like to ask you about this. What unique dimension does this partnership bring to the area of activity of Track 2 and similar programs in our region?
Thank you very much. My co-chair, Ashraf Ajmani, thank goodness made it, so I just want to say welcome. I'm so glad you asked that question, because
it was a complete coincidence.
Because from when David spoke to when Aman Suleiman and Michael spoke, it seems that there's a bit of a gap. And I would like to fill that gap and help you understand what the connection really is. I think that's what you're saying. And how does that impact all of us here? So first of all, from my perspective, Oxford is a Track 2 project. The OMS program is a Track 2 project, which they have successfully taken and run with, but never left us behind. The idea came from the region. It came from Track 2. Noam and I worked on it very hard. Noam then took it to Oxford, and everything is based on partnership. It's the Track 2 methodology. It's interdisciplinary, but more importantly, it's not Oxford academics who are running this project. It's Oxford academics with Oxford fellows who were recruited from the region. So right here is our Palestinian fellow, Shaddad Attili, who's going to speak in a few minutes, former water minister of Palestine. We've got top people from all over the region, and everything that has happened ground up. So the philosophy is ground up, top down, based on science. And everyone has been working very hard and very quietly now for 2 or 3 years. And it's the first time you have a team coming together from locals, arguing about needs, looking at the data, getting access to the data, using the same language. We were told yesterday, don't say wastewater treatment in Palestine anymore. Call it agricultural water use. I think Michael said that. So we've learned an awful lot from each other and with each other. Now, what you saw tonight is very sophisticated, in-depth modeling for the first time ever in the region. That will provide, this is just phase 1, but that data is not what's so interesting to Track 2 in and of itself. What's interesting to Track 2 is how do we take what's come out of that data and use it, leverage it for the partners in the region to talk and to come up together with the experts, with these world-class experts, on scenarios and options that meet each country's needs.
So in a perfect world, in your mind, after our friends from Oxford have done their presentations, partial results for the moment, maybe in a year, maybe in a couple of years, they will have the final findings. They meet with officials in Israel, in Palestine, in Jordan. In a perfect world, in your mind, what should come out of it? What should be the takeaway for the officials in these 3 countries to work with?
Okay, so nobody was clear tonight, because it's not in a few years, it's now. They finished phase 1. That's it, we're here. So we've reached stage 1 of the perfect world. The Energy Ministry of Israel was so excited by this that they called us up at night and said, okay, can you come back in and present it to the Electrical Authority? You all may not understand this and find it incomprehensible or boring. The professionals love it. They said they've never seen anything like it. We got the same response, which hopefully Shaddad will talk about, at the Energy Ministry in Ramallah. We know, because they've spent so much time in Jordan. Today we met with the Jordanian ambassador who said, this is so important because we believe we have to cooperate. I want to arrange for you to see Prince Hassan this week, like that. So in a perfect world, we first get the professionals to agree. We sign up the professionals across the region. This is Track 2, so that it's a professional project. And then we go up to the prime minister and presidential levels, and it's bottom up based on the projects that we've already started in the region. They can draw on this information as a strategy to know, wow, how many wastewater treatment plants should we put in Gaza? So how many trunk lines from El Biri? But it won't be their decision or our decision. It's everybody's decision in the partnership. That's where we're going with this.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Shaddad, Dr. Shaddad Attili, former Minister of Water and head of the Palestinian Water Authority, and currently an advisor close to the minister at of negotiation department, and also, as Debbie mentioned, an Oxford fellow who is working with us from the Palestinian side. Shaddad, not everyone knows, as I do, how passionate you are about the issues of the sustainability and environmental stability and resilience of Palestine in the future. You are the author of a really fundamental document in that area, which you call the Palestinian Green Deal, and you have authored many articles and spoken in many instances on behalf of the Palestinian Authority about these issues. I wanted to ask you, how does the issue resonate within Palestine, both the leadership and civil society? How seriously is this taken, and how cooperative do you find these parts of Palestinian society to the issue?
Good evening to you all. Very glad to be here with you tonight. Very glad to be part of Damour and part of Oxford and part of the track 2. And why it's important to track 2, let me tell you a story, Richard. This is why I like DFID and I like the British. Professor Shamir, it's good to see you here. Uri. So DFID used to be one of the funder of a project called EXACT. This project that Jordan, Israel, Palestine are working under the multilateral track. And they kept working. In the difficult period, they kept working together. So all people love this project, the EXACT project. And it's about water, okay? Until after several years, we had a meeting in Muscat in Oman, and DFID stepped in and said, guys, what you're doing is really marvelous, but we will not stay for a minute in this project. So we asked, Yani, if you're saying this is great, why you're leaving? He said, because you're doing a great job, and all of this technical work, it's excellent. But we didn't find the link between the technical and the political. So if your work remain at your circle, we didn't do anything. This is why we're saying you goodbye. Until you find this link, we will be coming back. Why I'm saying this, Debbie? Because this is what has been presented by Aman and Suleiman and Michael. It's very important. And let me tell you, from someone who's politician, and until today, I'm still a governmental official because I'm in my way out. This is the first time that Oxford team has worked on official data, taken from Palestine, taken from Israel, taken from Jordan. And this is the first time they were presenting to the authorities, and all people saying, great. And even I'm surprised when I heard our Minister of Energy saying, I'm happy to send our technical people for this joint modeling session. And it was the same for water. This is why my good friend Danny, ambassador, that the next phase, we have to work on this link. Because frankly, in our coming here this evening, the checkpoint has stopped us. We showed our permit. And the soldier was smiling, and we said, okay, fine, we will be passing. And then she said, please, aside. And they kept us for a couple of hours. Despite we're telling them we're going for a joint Israeli workshop. Okay, for them, they don't care. And it come to my mind that we shouldn't speak to the soldier. We have to speak to the politician who gives orders. And this is why we make a change. Why? Now I come to answer your question. Because whether we like or we don't like, we are sharing same resources, whether on water or environment and air. It's not of a Palestinian intention, whether they like you or not, to pollute the only source for both of us. And this is applicable on air, and this is applicable in all resources. And this is why, Ambassador, when we became state, we did sign international agreement on environment. And here is a good news that I'm going to tell you now, that Israel is a signatory to a Basin Convention, Palestine too. Israel is a signatory to Desertification Convention, Palestine too. Israel is signatory to Paris Protocol for Climate Change, Palestine too. So what's lacking then? If we agree and there is certain obligation under these convention and international agreement, it's obligation on Palestinian, obligation on Israeli, Suleiman, obligation on Jordanian, because you are also Jordan part of all these conventions. So, Debbie, please take it to the Presidential Forum for Climate Change. Why we don't sign a regional environmental protocol? Because we don't need, wallahi, to negotiate, because we already negotiated with Basin, with Paris, and we signed. So we take all these items under these conventions and agreement, we put it, sorry. It's
you're wasting our water.
No, this is our water you're taking. So this is part of our water. Okay. So we have to understand something, and this is the second part of the question, Danny, that the politicians, they don't have time to learn, okay, about environment and about hazardous waste, okay. They are taking decision. And this is a challenge that we have to face, how to educate them, how to get them knowing. And this is good because, Aman, you reflected the numbers in terms of money. People understand money. When you tell them you cooperate, this is 12 million, you don't cooperate, it's 18th. So you speak to Minister of Finance speak to the President, then they make a decision that, okay, go cooperate, because it's much cheaper for us. We shouldn't really take them to the model and how the model works. They don't care. They do have other 3,000 things to work on. But let's just work on this. So in conclusion, yes, sir, we're very much interested about environment. And we're doing our best. And we are now harmonizing our local laws with this signed agreement, and we are really in a big mess. Why? Example, CEDAW, which is for women. Some people, we sign without reservation. Israel signed with reservation, that anything that's without, against the religion, we couldn't. But we did agree for everything, and demonstration everywhere in West Bank against why Palestine joined CEDAW. So, no, the story is not because we are demonstrating. The story that we're taking seriously harmonizing our local law with the signed international agreement, and this is applicable on environment.
Thank you very much. I must say that our project is riding a certain wave in the sense that we are dealing with subject matter that is very fashionable right now. It has become fashionable. It wasn't at the beginning. Environmental challenges, climate change, etc. And we found, you are right to say, Shaddad, that you have to find the link to the politicians. I think in a sense there is already the beginning of such a link, because on both sides, I know better on the Israeli side than the Palestinian Jordanian, but I hear from our colleagues, I think the idea is more or less the same, that even political leaders in Israel who are not crazy about the idea of a political settlement currently of the conflict with Palestine, they are very comfortable or quite comfortable to cooperate on what they call civilian issues. And environmental issues is definitely within that realm. In this current government, luckily I must say, from the Israeli side, there were cabinet ministers appointed who were from the right side of from the left side, but the right, I mean the correct side, of the political spectrum. So our Minister of Environmental Affairs met with her Palestinian colleague more than once, and there was a beginning of cooperation, which hopefully will continue after the next political turmoil that this country is plunging into. Finally, Gil Murciano, Dr. Gil Murciano, who is Executive Director of the Mitvim Institute, which is a think tank in Israel, focused in particular on regional affairs, disclaimer, I have recently been invited to become a member of the board of Mitvim, and I'm very proud and grateful for that offer. But I asked you to join this panel because you come obviously from the second necessary link to what we're talking about, which is the diplomatic and political or international affairs aspect. And the organization you direct, although it is quite young, has gained, I must say, tremendous prestige in the realm of think tanks in the region and beyond. Its essential subject matter is analysis and prognostics of international relations, with a very particular focus on the region, the Middle East and the Mediterranean mostly. So maybe a slightly provocative question. In the title, we speak about threats and opportunities. Which do you prefer? Give him the...
I'd rather not.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I'm optimistic by nature, but I spent the last 3 days in the Knesset, so it might not be the right time to ask me about that. First of all, it's a pleasure as a political scientist to be surrounded by so many real scientists, you know, in this situation, obviously. And when you speak about foreign policy, I think that what we are experiencing right now, Debbie spoke about the combination, Shadad spoke about the importance of combining policy with the scientific technological knowledge. But you know, we are on the verge of a revolution, not just on scientific technological affairs or domestic affairs, but also in foreign policy, on the basic practice, on the way we do foreign policy. The alliances or the choice of alliances, the narratives, the decision-making structure are bound to change completely because of the topic of climate change. And in return, of course, the importance of cooperation is vital on the regional level, on international. So obviously you see an incredible combination here, but even when you look at climate change as a foreign policy issue, you can't ignore the fact that it has a very unique features. You know, this is one of those topics, somewhat of a cliche, just a warning, one of those topics that causes leaders and nations to forget about the immediate constraints and to think long-term, you know, to think in perspective. And I mention it's a cliche because we've seen a couple of contradictory cases where climate change could not change the entire situation. I can tell you that at Mitvim, our experience in the last couple of years has been that organizations, civil society, potential partners in countries with which Israel does not have diplomatic relations, that wouldn't participate in a multilateral, let alone bilateral discussion with us, climate change changes the situation, the exception to the norm. And the question is whether or not you can take this exception to the norm and help it shape the norm itself on that level, changing the incentive structure to cooperate. So this combination that we are discussing, this idea of a nexus, of a diplomatic or a political environmental nexus, where you cannot really plan a strategic step, a strategic political step, without it having an environmental logic. And on the other hand, you cannot take a major environmental action without having the policy framework, the political logic. Think about Mubadala and their attempt to build new infrastructure of oil pipelines to the Gulf of Eilat. I don't know if you had the chance to. And you know, the crown jewel of the Abraham Accords at the time in 2021, but you know, a major risk for ecosystem in the region, and therefore did not succeed in the long term. Same thing, by the way, when we speak about the Green Blue Deal, and the major challenge, you know, all the numbers are there, the resilience or the profit, how lucrative it is basically in the long term. But if you're missing the Palestinian aspect from this trilateral cooperation, can it actually last for long? And then when we think long term, we think about not just, you know, climate change as a platform for, you know, the next big thing in the Abraham Accords, but also reframing normalization. Trickle-down effect. You know, until now, what we mostly see, to be honest, in the Abraham Accords is elites. A connection between elites, different elites, I have to say, multi-layered, that is changing, but still, point to point. Can you create a trickle-down effect through dealing with human needs, through climate change? And it definitely go up. The bottom up, top down, I'm down for it completely, absolutely. But the second issue also is to change the nature, to leverage normalization against the, the intentions of the original architects as a tool to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace. Now, I mentioned the 3 days in the Knesset. Yeah, a total impasse when it comes to leaderships. In Israel, of course, and I don't think it's going to change the split, within the Palestinian national movement, but that's the interesting thing about climate change. It's the power of practice, without great celebrations. So if you can find, we are trying to always identify those practical steps that does more than just quality of life or, not exactly the economic peace Netanyahu style, but the practical steps that can have political momentum. And climate change and the field of renewable energy, food security, water security is exactly the set that provides this set of steps. So the revolutionary nature, opportunity versus, maybe a necessity to use the opportunity on that level.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gil. I'm hesitant because I have this idea to ask each of you in 60 seconds to give me one image that you would like to see 10 years from now on this, in this area. Can we? A few more minutes? Sure. So imagine 10 years from now, we have this project. Most of the people on the panel are involved in it. Gil doesn't know, but he probably will be involved in it in one way or another, because I see many ways for us to cooperate. Give me one ideal picture that you have in your mind 10 years from now about regional cooperation, environmental cooperation. Shadad, you want to start?
As a Palestinian, I start with ending occupation and also promoting regional cooperation. We shouldn't forget that we're just sitting along the Jordan River and the Dead Sea that is really dying, and despite all effort between the riparians, especially in the lower part of it, but until today, there is no single step is made forward toward rehabilitation of the river and addressing the shrinkage of the Dead Sea. And this is really a pity. And this is actually, it's a shame on all of us, Israeli, Jordanian, and Palestinian, that we look at the Dead Sea, which is a unique heritage of the whole world, a unique special body that is really dying. And we couldn't say stop to such shrinkage. Depoliticizing environment, this is what I really hope in the coming 10 years.
Great, thank you. Debbie.
I'm going to get very focused on these Oxford Fellows sitting in front of me and these nice gentlemen sitting on either side. And I'm going to say, from an optimistic point of view, that in 10 years, we're going to create a regional association for climate change and the environment. It's going to be based on science, which this modeling is starting. It's going to be communities of professionals who are going to have ongoing meetings, and it's going to be the guiding force for real projects on the ground and for real meetings between presidents, heads of states, and kings, and we're going to all come together around this common enemy.
Thank you. Tarek.
Okay, I think when we look to the targets that the governments in the region set for themselves to meet net zero emissions by 2050, this means that we need to change the way we live, change the way we produce our food, we produce our water, we produce our energy, ways that we run our transportation. So I would like to see these goals happening. Partially, but with the pace that we see in Israel, I think this will never happen. And I also would like to see in 10 years the Regional Climate Change Research Center at the Araba Institute, a hub, a climate change hub that will serve the whole region.
Gil.
A set of regional forums one renewable energy forum, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern in Nicosia. Water in Nicosia, yeah, also incorporating Turkey into the, obviously. No, but I'm, you know, if you have the chance to promote political goals. Second, a water regional forum, maybe in Amman, which both about management of water resources, but also issues of climate security are examined in this specific one. A biodiversity forum in Jericho or Batir, I don't know, one of the two. And the fourth one, you know, we leave for chance, but something in Iraq. I'm speaking about the combinations.
Thank you very much, Shaddad, Debbie, Tarek, and Gil. Before we part ways, just two remarks. One is to say that we have many supporters for the Track 2 Environmental Forum from around the world who help us tremendously, diplomatically and otherwise. One of these supporters is Dennis Ross, who is probably the world's biggest expert on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which is not always a very fulfilling career, but you know, that's life. He told us at several moments of our contacts that he has only one regret during about the work around the Oslo Accords and what came after that. And that is that they underestimated the role of civil society and of people-to-people projects. So that is a great encouragement to us because we see ourselves as sort of emissaries to mend that wrong. And although unfortunately for the moment, the Track 1, meaning the real subject matter, which is negotiations toward a two-state solution, are not moving forward, we feel that in our small field of influence, we have an obligation to move forward. The second remark is to say that regional cooperation, as I mentioned earlier, has become a real buzzword around the world and in Israel and in the region. The thing is that, at least from an Israeli perspective, the more comfortable idea about regional cooperation concerns the Gulf, the Abraham Accords. Everybody loves them. I see our role, among others, and I know I'm not alone here, to remind everyone that it is wonderful to have great relations with the UAE and with Bahrain and with Morocco and hopefully in the near future with Saudi Arabia. But we cannot forget that where we live is our neighborhood, meaning Palestine and Jordan next to us, and they have to remain a main focus of Israel's international relations and regional focus. We cannot just overlook them simply because there are some very rich people in the Gulf who want to buy lots of Israeli stuff. So that, I think, is really one of our goals, and it is on this note that I would like to thank all the participants. I want a special thank to Jesse and Evie and other people from the Arava Institute staff who made this possible. You did a great job. Thank you very, very much. I don't know if we have people still watching us online, but if you have survived so far, we congratulate you and we thank you for your attention. And to all of you who came here tonight, thank you, and we will see you next year. Thank you.